There is a war happening right now on the roof of the world. Bombs are falling, soldiers are dying, villages are being reduced to dust and silence. Two nuclear-armed neighbors, Pakistan and Afghanistan, are locked in a conflict that is getting bloodier by the day. Cross-border missile strikes, casualties in the hundreds, military posts seized, a defense minister standing in front of cameras saying, with what sounds almost like disbelief in his own voice, that an open war has started. But here is the question that keeps coming up in every serious intelligence briefing, every closed-door diplomatic conversation, and every geopolitical analysis being whispered in the corridors of power from Washington to Beijing to New Delhi. Is this really just a war between two neighbors? Or is there a third hand quietly resting on the chessboard? Pakistan thinks it knows the answer. Pakistani politicians, generals, and intelligence officials have been pointing in one direction with increasing desperation. Not at a warlord, not at a rogue faction, at India. They are saying, loudly, clearly, and repeatedly, that India has turned the Taliban into a weapon, that India is waging a war against Pakistan without firing a single official shot, that India is doing to Pakistan exactly what Pakistan spent 30 years doing to everyone else. Is this accusation a paranoid fantasy from a country slowly tearing itself apart? Or is it the panicked recognition of a nation realizing that the monster it created has been quietly adopted by someone far more patient and far more dangerous? Because the story of how India may have flipped the most explosive region in the world against the very country that spent decades trying to bleed it dry is one of the most extraordinary geopolitical stories of our time. And it begins not with diplomacy, not with armies. It begins with a photograph taken 45 years ago. The year is 1980. The Soviet Union has just rolled its tanks into Afghanistan. The Cold War is at its most dangerous. Nations are choosing sides overnight. And somewhere inside RAW, India's Foreign Intelligence Agency, a senior official named Naushirwan Suntuk is staring at a photograph that changes everything. Two men, standing together, smiling. On the left is Jalaluddin Haqqani, a founding figure of the Taliban and one of the most feared militant commanders the world has ever seen. On the right is Hamid Gul, the Director General of Pakistan's ISI. They look like old friends, because they were. Within days, dozens more photographs followed. Training camps, strategy sessions, joint prayers, operational meetings. The picture forming was not just uncomfortable, it was terrifying. Pakistan was building something massive, something that was going to reshape the entire region. Here is what RAW understood immediately. Afghanistan had never been India's enemy. In fact, it was Pakistan's enemy. The Durand Line, that jagged colonial border cutting through Pashtun tribal land, had been a source of conflict between Afghanistan and Pakistan since the very day Pakistan came into existence. In 1947, when Pakistan applied for UN membership, every country on earth voted in favor. Every single one, except Afghanistan. That one lone vote against tells you everything about how deep this mutual hatred runs. So Pakistan had one overriding obsession: control Kabul, install a loyal government, close the door on India. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, Pakistan saw its opportunity. Working with the CIA and funded by American money, the ISI set up training camps along the Afghan border. Into these camps flowed weapons, ideology, and fighters from across the Muslim world. Out of these camps came an army. That army was the Taliban. A Pakistani general later admitted on camera that his country had brought fighters from all over the world, trained them, armed them, and sent them into Afghanistan. He even called Osama bin Laden a hero. No apology, no regret, just cold acknowledgement of what had been done. By 1996, the Taliban swept into Kabul and overthrew the existing government. For Pakistan, this was triumph. A puppet state, a friendly neighbor, a closed door against India. Pakistan thought it had won the game. It had actually made the biggest mistake in its history. September 11th, 2001. Nearly 3,000 people dead. America identified the architects almost immediately. Al-Qaeda, operating from Afghanistan, protected by the Taliban. Within months, American forces were in Afghanistan. The Taliban government Pakistan had spent 2 decades building collapsed overnight. Taliban commanders fled across the border into Pakistan. Mullah Omar went into hiding in Quetta. Osama bin Laden settled in Abbottabad, a short drive from a major Pakistani military academy. Under enormous international pressure, Pakistan was forced to make a choice: cut ties with the militants, dismantle the training camps, go after the very groups it had spent decades nurturing. Pakistan did it, and that is when the monster turned around. The militants Pakistan had raised and armed responded to this betrayal with violence directed at Pakistan itself. Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, was founded with one explicit goal: jihad against the Pakistani state, to establish an Islamic caliphate in the Pashtun regions, to finish what had been started. Today, 85% of the violence inside Pakistan is concentrated in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan. Soldiers dying, civilians dying, children dying, schools being bombed by the very ideology Pakistan once exported across the region. Even former ISWO Chief Assad Durrani acknowledged what had happened. When pressed on whether Pakistan had created a Frankenstein monster, he called it collateral damage, blowback from pragmatic policies, as if thousands of dead Pakistani civilians were simply an acceptable cost of doing business. Pakistan had spent 30 years building a weapon. That weapon now had its hands around Pakistan's throat. Look at a map of Pakistan. In the southwest sits Balochistan, vast, resource-rich, and strategically critical. It is also the cornerstone of China's massive investment through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And it is on fire. On January 31, 2026, the Baloch Liberation Army launched Operation Hero. In a single day, they struck 48 different locations across Pakistan: military installations, government buildings, a coordinated assault described as one of the deadliest in 7 decades of conflict. 102 Pakistani soldiers killed. The BLA carries out between 150 and 200 attacks every year. Since 2020, that number has quadrupled. Other groups have joined: the Baloch Liberation Front, the Baloch Republican Army, United Baloch Front, and others, all carrying the same message: Balochistan will be free. Pakistan is not fighting one war. It is fighting 5 simultaneously: against the TTP, against the BLA, against the Taliban across the border, against its own economic collapse, inflation spiraling, electricity bills crushing ordinary families, a prime minister traveling the world begging for billions just to keep the lights on, and against the growing rage of its own people in Kashmir, Sindh, and across the Pashtun belt. This is the context in which the Afghanistan-Pakistan war is being fought. And this is where India enters the picture. India has always had a special relationship with Afghanistan. Ask an ordinary Afghan about India, and the response is almost always warm, sometimes deeply emotional. There is a love there, ancient, not fully explainable, that has survived decades of civil war, foreign occupation, and Taliban rule. An Afghan man holds up a phone case designed with Indian currency motifs, saying with genuine pride that India and Afghanistan are like brothers. This is India's real influence in Afghanistan. Not missiles, not money alone, something softer, harder to measure, and ultimately far more durable. Pakistan has always known this, always feared this. It is precisely why Pakistan spent so much blood and treasure trying to install a government in Kabul that would shut India out. When the Taliban took over in 2021, it looked like Pakistan had finally succeeded. ISY officials were photographed in Kabul drinking tea with Taliban ministers. The Taliban made statements supporting the Kashmiri struggle. India was suddenly facing a hostile government in Kabul for the first time in 20 years. India was in a difficult position. Every strategic calculation it had made about Afghanistan had to be reconsidered overnight. And here is where India did something remarkable. Instead of retreating, instead of declaring the Taliban illegitimate and walking away, India made a cold, clear-eyed, pragmatic decision. It decided to deal with reality as it was, not as it wished it to be. The Taliban came to power in August 2021. By 2022, Afghanistan's economy was in catastrophic freefall, reserves frozen, aid suspended, children suffering from severe malnutrition, a country on the edge of complete collapse. Pakistan, which had spent decades presenting itself as Afghanistan's most important patron, was itself drowning. Foreign reserves depleted, inflation spiraling. Pakistan had nothing meaningful to give Afghanistan. India had wheat. Quietly, India began sending humanitarian assistance. 2,000 metric tons of wheat, 13 tons of essential medicines, 500,000 COVID vaccine doses, 60 million polio vaccine doses, $27 million specifically allocated in India's national budget for Afghanistan. That last detail matters. India, which officially does not recognize the Taliban as a legitimate government, put money for Afghanistan directly into its national budget. That is not charity. That is strategy dressed in humanitarian clothing. And the Taliban understood exactly what was happening. Simultaneously, India opened back-channel diplomatic communications. Consulates began processing Afghan matters. A secret meeting reportedly took place between Indian officials and Abbas Staniksai, the Taliban's deputy foreign minister. Nobody knows exactly what was discussed. Nobody was supposed to know the meeting even happened. But after that meeting, something shifted. The Taliban's rhetoric toward Pakistan became increasingly hostile. The warmth that had characterized their relationship began to cool, then freeze, then shatter. By 2022, when Pakistan carried out an airstrike on Afghan territory, the Taliban responded not with the meek submission Pakistan expected from its old proxy, but with an open threat. Something had changed in Kabul. The question was what, and who was behind it? Of all the developments in this story, perhaps the most stunning is what happened to the Haqqani network. For decades, the Haqqanis were Pakistan's most trusted asset inside Afghanistan. They carried out operations advancing Pakistani interests, maintained deep ISI connections, and served as the enforcement arm of Pakistani influence in Kabul. Pakistan considered them practically family. Now, in the current Pakistan-Afghanistan war, the Haqqanis are not standing with Pakistan. Pakistan's own defense minister was forced to publicly accuse them of betrayal, to demand they choose sides, to admit that his country's most important Afghan asset had flipped. How does something like that happen? The answer, according to Pakistani officials and American intelligence sources, points toward India. The same back-channel engagement that brought wheat to Kabul, those same channels, Pakistan alleges, reached all the way into the Haqqani network itself. Indian strategic analyst Bharat Karnad has written that Pakistan actually approached American officials specifically asking them to stop India from applying strategic pressure. The CIA itself has acknowledged, carefully in the deniable language of intelligence assessments, that India is using Taliban networks to target Pakistani-backed militants. And here is the darkest irony in this entire story. India, the country that spent 30 years watching Pakistan use militant proxies to bleed it in Kashmir, to bomb its cities, to kill its soldiers, may have learned the game, may have turned the strategy around, with greater patience, greater sophistication, and greater effectiveness than anyone expected. Pakistan created the Taliban. India may have quietly recruited it. To understand why this is all possible, you have to understand a line drawn on a map in 1893. Britain, engaged in the great game against Imperial Russia, had tried 3 times to conquer Afghanistan militarily. 3 wars, 3 disasters. So Britain changed its approach. In 1893, diplomat Sir Mortimer Durand negotiated with Afghan ruler Amir Abdur Rahman to draw a line through the heart of Pashtun territory, a buffer zone between British India and Russian expansion. The line cut directly through Pashtun tribal lands. Families divided, villages split. A people with shared language, culture, and history suddenly found themselves citizens of different countries based on which side of an arbitrary colonial line their house happened to fall. When Pakistan was created in 1947, Pashtuns were given exactly 2 choices: join India or join Pakistan. No independent Pashtunistan. The dream was crushed before it was ever formally expressed. Afghanistan, which had never recognized the Durand Line as legitimate, watched this happen with fury and cast that historic lonely vote against Pakistani UN membership. This wound is still bleeding today. The TTP draws its membership from Pashtun communities that have never accepted Pakistani sovereignty. The Afghan Taliban itself is a Pashtun movement with deep tribal connections across the Durand Line. When Pakistan asks Afghanistan to hand over TTP fighters, it is asking one Pashtun community to betray another. This is a structural contradiction that no military force can resolve. It is a fundamental incompatibility baked into the creation of Pakistan itself. India has understood this for decades and waited. Before the world can appreciate what India may be doing now, it must understand what India endured for 3 decades. From the late 1980s onward, Pakistan used the militant infrastructure it built in Afghanistan to wage a sustained proxy war against India in Kashmir. Fighters trained in camps near the Afghan border were redirected across the line of control. Weapons purchased with American money for the Afghan jihad found their way into the hands of militants, killing Indian soldiers and civilians. Pakistan's former Prime Minister Pervez Musharraf admitted this on camera. He said that Pakistan had trained these fighters and supported them, calling them mujahideen fighting for their rights. He said this without shame, as a matter of historical record. Thousands of Indian soldiers died. Thousands of Indian civilians died. Hundreds of thousands of Kashmiri Hindus were driven from their homes. Bombings in Indian cities. Attacks on the Indian parliament. The endless, grinding violence of a proxy war conducted by a neighbor that had signed peace agreements while running killing operations in the background. India absorbed all of this, year after year, decade after decade, and throughout it all, India largely played by the rules, filed diplomatic protests, built its economy, strengthened its military, and waited. The waiting may now be over. There is something that distinguishes India's approach from Pakistan's. It is not strength or money. It is patience. Pakistan's strategy has always been frantic and short-term. Create a militant group. Use it. Worry about the consequences later. It is the strategy of a country that has always felt existentially threatened, always operating in crisis mode. India's strategy, if the pattern emerging in Afghanistan is indeed India's doing, is the opposite: slow, patient, operating across decades, not news cycles, building influence through genuine goodwill before converting that goodwill into strategic leverage. After 2001, when a new government was established in Kabul, India moved in fast and deep. Roads were built, dams were constructed. The Afghan parliament building was a gift from India. Schools were funded. Thousands of Afghan students were brought to study in Indian universities. India spent years building genuine goodwill in Afghanistan, not the corrupt transactional goodwill that Pakistan bought through ISUI payments to Taliban commanders, but the deeper, more durable goodwill that comes from actually improving people's lives. When the Taliban swept back into power in 2021, that goodwill did not evaporate, it transferred. The Afghan people, even under Taliban rule, did not forget who had built their roads, hospitals, and schools. They did not forget which country's doctors and engineers had lived among them. They did not forget the wheat that arrived when their children were starving. India had invested in the Afghan people. And the Afghan people, even in a form India never expected or wanted, were returning that investment. Wars do not always begin with declarations. Sometimes they begin with photographs, with wheat shipments, with quiet meetings in Mumbai and Hyderabad, with humanitarian convoys rolling across mountain passes, with scholarships offered to young Afghans who grow up remembering which country treated them with dignity. The Pakistan-Afghanistan war is real. The bombs are real. The dead are real. The suffering of ordinary people on both sides of the Durand Line is real and must never be lost in the strategic analysis. But behind the smoke and ruins, there is a story about something larger, about a civilization 5,000 years old that has been invaded, carved up, colonized, and told repeatedly that it does not matter, that it will always be defined by the crises on its borders rather than the strength within them. That civilization is still here, still building, still patient, still watching. Pakistan built its strategy on chaos. It is now drowning in the chaos it created. And India, watching, building, investing in relationships that last, stands in a position of unprecedented strategic advantage. India did not start this fire. This fire was burning long before India arrived. The Durand Line was drawn by a British diplomat, The Taliban was built by Pakistani intelligence. The TTP was born from Pakistani betrayal. The Balak insurgency grew from Pakistani oppression. India did not create any of these forces, but a strategically sophisticated nation understands that it does not always need to create the conditions for its own advantage. Sometimes it only needs to recognize the moment, position carefully, and let the structural forces already in motion do the heavy work. Whatever the full truth turns out to be, and perhaps the classified files of RAW will only confirm it 50 years from now, if ever, one thing is already structurally certain: the deeper the conflict between Pakistan and Afghanistan grows, the stronger India's position becomes. Every rupee Pakistan spends fighting on its western frontier is a rupee not spent on its confrontation with India. Every Pakistani soldier killed in Balochistan or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is a soldier not stationed on the eastern border. Pakistan chose 30 years ago to build its power on destruction. It is now being destroyed by the destruction it created. India chose something different: roads, schools, wheat, vaccines, dignity. And as Pakistan's defense minister appears on television accusing India of orchestrating his country's nightmare, as the 30-year doctrine of proxy warfare collapses under its own catastrophic weight, perhaps the most important question is not whether India played a role in this. Perhaps the real question is simpler and more profound than any intelligence analysis. When a country spends 30 years trying to destroy its neighbor through terror, chaos, and manufactured violence, and that neighbor responds not with destruction, but with patience, wisdom, and the quiet accumulation of genuine human goodwill, which of those two countries deserves to win? History is answering that question right now. Along the Durand Line, in the wheat fields of Afghanistan, in the quiet offices of RAW, in the desperate press conferences of a Pakistani establishment that built a monster and is now being consumed by it, history does not forget, and history does not lie.